Welcome once again to Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific? It is I, Ray Powell, military veteran and man about town. It is he, Jim Caruso, Foreign Service veteran and all-around good guy. Jim Caruso, the West Coast is currently enduring an atmospheric river and a bomb cyclone. Ever see anything like that down in Tucson?
No, we just have sunshine, sometimes too much. And of course, on the East Coast, Northeast, we're having drought and wildfires, which of course are supposed to be your specialty. So I can't explain it. But who can explain almost anything? This is our guest today, Doug Ramage. Doug is, well, let me begin by saying I first met Doug, it must have been 2009, because when I first arrived at the country in a new post, I try and find smart people to explain things to me. And Doug did all he could to try and make me smarter. He failed, but he made a good effort. Doug has lived in Indonesia over 30 years, worked for international institutions there, currently Barrow Group Asia's managing director out of Jakarta. Doug, welcome. Good to see you.
Thank you, Jim. Good to see you. And Ray, good to see you too.
All right. So let's start with our first question. Why should our audience care about the Prabowo era?
Well, I think, Jim, for a couple of things that still that characterize Indonesia now, right? Little known still, but it is a $1 trillion economy, member of the G20, largest economy in Southeast Asia, and a steadily improving investment destination, so of increasing importance for American and other international companies. But also, like the United States, Indonesia had an election this past year, and Indonesia voted into office a former or a long-standing candidate for the presidency. He's won the presidency on his third attempt, Prabowo Subianto. He's just been inaugurated about a month ago, and he faced the task of helping to navigate the rapidly rising tensions in Asia-Pacific. There's been a lot of international attention as to whether or not Indonesia would lean towards China or not. What directions would Indonesia take in terms of both its investment climate and its geopolitical stance under Indonesia's new president? And how will Indonesia manage its relationship with the new incoming president in the United States?
So, Doug, if this is the beginning of the Prabowo era, it is also the end of an era, right? So, Jokowi Widodo has been president of Indonesia, or had been president of Indonesia for 10 years. How would you characterize the Widodo era, the Jokowi era? What were the major developments over that past decade, and what impact did he have on Indonesia and the region?
Jokowi's legacy is, I think, profound. He leaves behind a country of, and really I'll talk about it in two different ways, right? He leaves behind an Indonesia which is wealthier, more prosperous, more politically, or continued political stability is a hallmark of Indonesia, so quite different from many countries in the region. Political stability, with a note to that, though, Ray, with some concerns among Indonesian observers about the perceived decline in the quality of Indonesia's democracy and some concerns about a weakening of civil society. The other primary legacy the president leaves behind is a country with a significantly improved investment climate. Indonesia, at the beginning of his presidency a decade ago, failed to attract significant investment from the world's best companies, other than from some natural resource companies. And he set about a 10-year period, if not transforming Indonesia, at least a relatively successful effort to make Indonesia more competitive, to attract greater foreign direct investment flows in Asia Pacific. So that's his twin legacy, political stability and an improved investment climate.
So when I was in Indonesia with you, Doug, we talked about the rules that required foreign investment and required value added if we're going to extract natural resources. And there was concern that would actually drive investment away. But what you're saying is actually has succeeded in the plan to bring in more value added investment.
Indonesia, there's two dimensions to this, Jim. I mean, on the one hand, what Indonesia has done, they've taken the huge step to eliminate something that was notorious in the years you were working in Indonesia. Indonesia had a so-called negative investment list. In other words, it started every conversation with foreign investors about what you could not invest in. So, and there was a list of hundreds of areas where foreigners could not own 100%, or their ownership would be limited, or entire sectors that were forbidden for foreign direct investment. And the number one recommendation from international chambers of commerce, American Chamber of Commerce, which I used to lead in Indonesia, World Bank, and so on, was always let foreigners invest in any sector they wish. This has been a key marker of success in other successful emerging economies. And they did that. They eliminated that. But so Jim, in other words, they have opened up areas for American and other foreign companies to invest in dramatically, removing almost all restrictions, ownership restrictions, and sectors they could invest in. But at the same time, Indonesia has found what they believe to be success in compelling companies, particularly in starting in minerals and natural resources, to add value domestically before raw materials are exported. Indonesia calls this downstreaming, and now is even established under President Prabowo a minister for investment and downstreaming, perhaps the only country in the world with a minister for downstreaming. So they're continuing along this track, but with a greater mix of incentives and liberalization.
Well, that sort of leads us into the question of so President Prabowo has now had an election campaign, which had certain themes to it, and now he's had a transition period where he's put together a cabinet. What have all of these things told us about what a President Prabowo's term is likely to emphasize?
Ray, I think there was enormous emphasis over the past year, the themes of continuity. Indonesian government officials, political parties, all three presidential candidates, Indonesia's Chamber of Commerce, all stressed that what we would all see in Indonesia is continuity, regardless of who won the election, particularly with Prabowo winning the election as he was Jokowi's favored candidate. However, after the election, which was almost a year ago, it was in February earlier this year, we've learned a lot more about Prabowo's priorities. And I think what the international and perhaps even some of the Indonesian community missed was that Prabowo and his team were proposing vastly increased investment in human welfare, human capital, social development, arguably an area where Indonesia has underinvested for a long time. So actually quite welcome things. So signature programs to invest in nutrition, better healthcare, better education, generally warmly welcomed. And so that's been the big shift in development priorities, but it also requires a vastly increased amount of money. So the real question in recent months has been, where will Indonesia under Prabowo administration find the money? Where will they get the revenue to fund these ambitious social development, social welfare programs the president is proposing?
Well, given his background as a special forces general, do you expect defense to be cut or added to?
It's quite likely that defense spending will increase, but it's not proposed dramatically to increase. I think Indonesia will maintain a trajectory where it's never been particularly focused on spending enormous amounts of money on its armed forces. There is an important, long-standing bipartisan, English doesn't really have that term here, Jim, but widely shared belief among all elites that Indonesia has probably underinvested in its armed forces for some time. And there's been a defense modernization program underway for years. So we're likely to see some modest increases there. But even though Prabowo just took office a month ago, he and his team were deeply involved in drafting the country's budget for 2025. And that budget includes a modest 9% increase in spending overall, significant new increases in human welfare, particularly a signature nutrition or free meals program similar to Head Start in the United States, and a very modest increase in the defense budget.
So President Prabowo's first big trip, of course, went to Beijing. And I don't think there's not anything particularly to read into that, I don't think. But what did make a lot of headlines was he came back with an announcement of joint development with China in, quote, disputed areas of the South China Sea. And that did stir up quite a ruckus. What did all that mean? Did it mean anything? Or, what was it? Is this something that we need to pay attention to? Or is this something that's likely to sort of die quietly?
I think the latter, Ray. I think that there was a lot of President Prabowo has been to Beijing twice this year. Actually, this is his second trip. So the Chinese government invited him after he won the Indonesian election. So he went 6 months ago or so to Beijing. At that time, kind of igniting again a storm of media stories about whether Indonesia was going to lean towards China, given that's where he went. He went there first simply because the Chinese were the first government to invite him. Subsequently, he went all over the world before he was inaugurated. And then he went back to Beijing, first state visit after his inauguration, yes. In many ways, the trip was very Jokowi-esque, with commercial and investment development at the heart of it. The president brought a huge delegation of Indonesian business leaders, Indonesian Chamber of Commerce, and a huge retinue of cabinet ministers. The declaration about the South China Sea has been subsequently clarified by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and all foreign policy observers, foreign policy officials in Indonesia as not representing any deviation whatsoever from Indonesia's very long-standing position on rejecting Chinese claims in the South China Sea. So I think perhaps more we put it down to perhaps language that would have been phrased differently and put it down to kind of a new team in place rather than a significant deviation in any sense. Prabowo, could I just add this, Ray? Prabowo is a very mainstream conservative in the sense a mainstream Indonesian official. And Indonesia, our analysis is that Indonesia will adhere closely to its long-held strategy of extreme pragmatism and genuine neutrality, something that the West scoffs at. Jim, you and I joked this years ago. I would hear American diplomats make jokes that Indonesia kind of felt that the Bandung Non-Aligned Conference occurred last year, and there would be some denigration of that view. But it is absolutely how Indonesia sees the world, that the only way that it can navigate in a dangerous environment is to be able to maintain excellent relations with all the world's major powers. And I think Prabowo is demonstrating that in spades in his first weeks in office, straight from Beijing to Washington, DC, off to Latin America for the 2 summits, now to the UK for a state visit, with commercial relationships also at the heart of those visits as well.
Already he's showing a new approach from his predecessor, given that Jokowi famously liked to stay home, and Prabowo clearly likes time on the airplane. But what does this bode for ASEAN? ASEAN famously is slow, endless meetings. Prabowo is not famous for his patience. How do you think he'll try and lead ASEAN to be more active, or will he ignore it?
I see early signs are extremely warm relationship with ASEAN leaders, very close rapport developed and long-standing with Malaysia's Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, with the new Prime Minister in Singapore, with Thailand's new government. I think that President Prabowo and his team doing what all Indonesian governments have done before, Jim, establishing by visits, meetings, body language, statements that ASEAN remains absolutely critical to Indonesia. But you'll see a more assertive Indonesian leadership there for sure, which is what, as you know, member states usually want.
So obviously there has been another election since President Prabowo has taken office. And the results of that election have ended up with a new administration coming in the United States, which is likely to have some very different policies toward especially things like trade, but also security and other things. What kinds of things keep Indonesian officials up at night? What do they worry about, or what are they excited about with the advent of a Trump administration?
Ray, I think to address how the government here may perceive the Trump administration, a lot of attention was paid immediately to how, after Trump's victory was announced, Indonesia's stock market went down immediately. I mentioned that, and I'll come back to it in a second. So 2 weeks earlier, Prabowo announced his cabinet in anticipation of cabinet of continuity and policies, and then after the reality of a cabinet which showed extreme continuity. 17 ministers held over from Jokowi era, many of them in the same or related economic policy making and sectoral posts. So business community got the continuity that was promised, and were very surprised, pleasantly so, by the retention of the well-regarded Minister of Finance, Sri Mulyani. So after the cabinet was announced, the rupiah strengthened, and the IDX went up about 2.5%. a strong sense that Indonesia was on the right track with this cabinet from an investment and business perspective. Trump wins 2 weeks later, the IDX takes a strong hit. And the instant analysis was that Indonesia would somehow be disadvantaged or damaged in an era of a Trump administration. I don't think that's true at all, necessarily. Indonesian officials and many in the new cabinet worked well with the United States when Trump was president before. I think they see the Trump experience from his previous presidency as one in which they could make deals with the United States. There is a comfort level working with the United States, which they feel in a more explicitly deal-making mode. So I think it's perhaps a comfort level. And if anything, there's no real controversy in Indonesia in terms of Trump's election, and relatively modest to low Indonesian interest in the American election, and an overall sense that I would do business with them just fine. The risks, Ray, are entirely external. So it's not Indonesia, United States concerns. And we saw that when Prabowo was in Washington, within hours of arriving, he made a call to President-elect Trump, recorded that, put it on his Instagram. That's gotten enormous commentary, both in Indonesia and internationally. But the risks are more external. Could Indonesia perhaps be damaged indirectly if there's an escalation in U.S.-China trade disputes? If tariffs, punishingly high tariffs, are slapped on China, would that depress Chinese growth, leading to a reduction in Chinese imports of Indonesian raw materials or semi-finished goods and others, having thereby a knock-on effect to the Indonesian economy? And the concerns are just generally dollar-based, right? So the markets went down because they see capital fleeing to the United States. And with the assumption that a Trump presidency brings higher U.S. interest rates, capital will go to the U.S. and Indonesia will become more expensive for Indonesia to borrow. So this has immediately reinforced what has turned out to be actually a very prudent, conservative and budget and fiscal team in the Prabowo administration, and any sense of kind of borrowing their way to funding their massive development agenda has been set aside. So it's really external risk, dollar-based concerns, rather than any particular concern of working well with the Trump administration.
The other side of the coin is, of course, the relationship with China. China's now a big investor in Indonesia. But also, Indonesia is becoming more and more an export destination for Chinese goods, in some cases driving out Indonesian manufacturers, which must be putting incredible political pressure on the new administration in Indonesia. How do you see that going?
Jim, just having this guy, I think I know where you're heading. You would remember the negative impact that the first China-Indonesia trade deal signed when Yudhoyono was president. It had the almost immediate impact of devastating low-end Indonesian manufacturing. Home appliances, rice cookers, small farm implements, gone, devastated. Indonesian toy industry, gone, right? It was a pretty negative experience for Indonesia. And I think Indonesia now approaches trade agreements, which it still loves, by the way. So Indonesia may be protectionist at home, and hopefully we can get to that later, but there's never been an international trade agreement that Indonesia wasn't interested in ultimately agreeing to. It's kind of the irony of it. And it's rarely remarked upon by policymakers and observers. But the issue with China, though, is there's a sense, and if you will, to be fair, a legitimate appreciation that China was willing to downstream some of its industries before other investors would. China was willing to build the smelters. China was willing to start adding value domestically in ways in which Indonesia saw that other companies from other countries were much more hesitant to do. So there is an appreciation for China having jump-started that downstream investment, and a genuine recognition that investment in the downstream nickel industry, despite the enormous concerns on environmental and other issues, has contributed significantly to Indonesia maintaining a 5% annual GDP growth rate the past decade. So I think there's a much more realistic perception of where both countries can benefit from these relationships.
So
there's one area to watch
out. No, go ahead.
Sorry, Ray, I was going to in the commercial and business relationship. The one area to watch, though, would be the defense and aviation sector. Despite Indonesia having had warm political relationship and excellent commercial investment relationship with Indonesia now for more than 25 years, the one area that's been completely off balance has been defense. Indonesia had a strategic cooperation agreement with China that stretches back to the Yudhoyono period. And this has now been expanded or reiterated in the most recent iteration. And it does make some reference to defense collaboration. I think where a lot of eyes in the defense industry will be is whether there is any that materializes, whether Indonesia would depart from 60 years of practice and we would see any defense and or aviation deals with China. I actually don't expect that, but there is that would be one thing to watch in terms of Indonesia's relationship with China. So I can't hear you, Ray.
And I did it again. That microphone button. While we were talking earlier, and we'll leave this in, we just got a new Roomba for the house, and it began to seek out its environment as we were working on this. I couldn't figure out what that noise was in the background. So, the fun of doing a live podcast is that you can't take that stuff out, but we'll just leave that part in. You talked about Indonesia's protectionism and perceptions of that. And first of all, I guess, what is the reality of Indonesia? How protectionist is it? And given, going back to Trump 2.0, what was Indonesia's experience like under Trump 1.0, given that Donald Trump is known to sort of take a more aggressive stand, the more protectionist he perceives your country to be when dealing on trade issues?
When Trump was president last time, Indonesian officials, some of whom still in Prabowo's team, used to joke when they met American officials. They would say, "Well, you have made in America, and you have an America first policy. Well, we have an Indonesia first policy. Now let's make a deal." So it was disarming. This language was used by Indonesian officials in negotiations with American officials during the Trump period. One kind of just a deft way of saying something with a bit of humor, but they genuinely mean it. And I think that the issues are more fundamental, though, than the Trump administration. They've been longstanding. I think the challenge for Indonesia, as we acknowledge the investment climate reforms the country has made, the fact that we do have year-on-year steadily increasing FDI, and American investment has moved up significantly. So, Jim, when you were here in Jakarta, the United States was the 6th or 7th largest foreign direct investor in Indonesia. Now it's number 4. It's been the fastest mover, if you will, over the last 20 years. So this is significant. So this is real. And American companies are benefiting from the liberalization. That's a bad word in any country nowadays, but the opening up of more areas for foreign direct investment. But the biggest tension, kind of the elephant in the room, is that it's the perception of the international business community that Indonesia, on the one hand, believes that it can have an open investment climate, kind of a y'all come. Indonesia's open for business. We've liberalized, we've reduced logistics costs, etc. At the same time, maintaining I think, an increasingly protectionist approach to trade. And it's not a formula we've seen that generally works in other upper middle income countries around the world when they open, liberalize, smooth, make themselves more competitive for FDI. They tend to also see some more predictability and flexibility and somewhat less protectionism on the trade front. So that tension is inherent here. And we see it manifested. We talked already about the government long wanting companies to add value on the mineral side. We're going to talk more about that, to the point they have a minister for downstreaming, but also local content regulations. That's where the rubber hits the road. I think at their core, Indonesian officials believe that without some degree of requirement or compulsion or sanction, that foreign companies would generally prefer to sell into the market rather than producing in the market. So there's been a correct diagnosis, if you will, for some years now in Indonesia, that Indonesia is not growing faster, has extreme concerns about being stuck in a middle income or upper middle income trap, unless Indonesia can get more foreign investors to add value domestically, thereby creating higher quality jobs, right? And more knock-on effect. Not unrealistic, but it leads to often almost uncompliable local content regulations, and that's where the frustration really lies.
Well, I was going to ask, I know there's certain high-tech products which require certain domestic content, which Indonesia, as far as I know, doesn't produce. How are they importing these high-tech goods if they can't meet the local content requirements?
Well, herein lies some of one of the most important changes in Indonesia in recent years. Indonesian officials and Indonesian government generally, though, have become, all across the board, have become much more sophisticated about understanding the commercial implications of things like local content regulations. So the strict local content regulations have inevitably become a starting point, a signal for room for negotiation, and an unspoken invitation for foreign companies to work closely with government and propose alternative ways to add value. So what might come up as a hardware requirement for technology items, for high-tech items to be produced in Indonesia, investors point out there's no global supply chain or very little supply chain in Indonesia. Hard for us to realize that. Well, are there other areas you can invest in then? Are there other areas where you can add domestic content? And that's where we see some considerable success. But it's hard work, Jim. I mean, companies have to. The Indonesian government won't propose what the solutions are, and they expect the companies to come to them. But those companies which have done that have seen great success. So a good example would be that Indonesia, it was announced last year, so MSD, Merck, produces its blockbuster HPV vaccine, Gardasil, marketed internationally, one of the most valuable vaccines in the world. That's now available in Indonesia. Critically important for public health. One of the highest cervical cancer rates in the world is Indonesia. They need that vaccine. It's now marketed locally as Nusagard in an arrangement that I think the company is very proud of, where they will market it together with a state-owned pharmaceutical company, Bio Farma. But whereas a quick glance of local content regulations for vaccines would suggest that to sell that here, that vaccine would need to be manufactured here. But it's not, because government understands that you cannot go from zero to manufacturing one of the most sophisticated vaccines in the world. You have to have a more modest starting point. I think that's just an excellent example where you see a lot more commercial awareness of what is doable on the part of the world's best companies. So a lot of those deal maker type officials are still in cabinet, which is one of the reasons why you saw a relatively good market reaction. But the starting point is protectionism, local content, forced downstreaming. That's the starting point.
Doug, when Indonesia looks at its place on the world stage and as a regional player, how does it see itself? Does it see itself, for example, as the leader of ASEAN? Does it see itself as an important rising power in the region? How does it see itself as an actor in the interplay between nations, and to what extent is a President Prabowo likely to differ from a President Jokowi in his approach?
It's a how Indonesia sees itself, I think, is rapidly changing, Ray. I think that I see it now as a matter of kind of concentric circles building out. So ASEAN is at its core. I think we can see, as we discussed earlier, that Indonesia still has a strong ASEAN relationship, warm relations with, and also a leadership role in ASEAN at its core. But as you move out, Indonesia sees that it does have and should play a leadership role in other ways globally, particularly in the Muslim world. Indonesia remains very proud of its role, and as they see themselves as one of the leaders of the Organization of Islamic Countries. Most significantly was Indonesia in the G20, and Indonesia's hosting of the G20, and critically for Indonesia, the B20, the business 20 that came days before, a couple of years ago, was absolutely critical for Indonesia. That really cemented how Indonesia sees itself as one of the world's major economies and on the rise. And this ambition infuses kind of long-term government planning now, a desire to have Indonesia take its place as one of the top 8, 10 most prosperous countries in the world on the 100th anniversary of its birth, so by 2045. So therefore, that leads to Indonesia's next identity, a likely member of the OECD, or we should say a hoped-for member of the OECD. When this was first announced, when Jokowi was president, that Indonesia wanted to get OECD membership, there was a lot of scoffing. Oh, how could that be? How could Indonesia see itself in the company of those countries? But I think that discourse has rapidly changed. I think from Indonesia's international partners, a view that, well, this is great. This could help propel Indonesia along the lines to further reforms that will be necessary to get it to that stage. And within Indonesia, I think the most savvy policymakers see OECD membership as something to compel further domestic reforms. So again, seeing itself in that community of nations is a big, big change for Indonesia in recent years. And we've seen an added dimension that Prabowo is responsible for. Indonesia clearly keen also to be a more active participant in BRICS, something that I think some of his predecessors scoffed at a bit. So multiple relationships, multiple layers, and you saw that Prabowo was very good on the international stage in his kind of maiden engagements at the G20, APEC in recent weeks.
So as we talk to our friends and colleagues in the region, you hear a lot of some echoing of the Chinese approach that the U.S. is trying to contain China, is trying to pick a fight with China, and given that China's the largest trade and economic partner for these countries, they're saying, you guys cool it. How does Indonesia view America's role in the region? What it should be?
And essential, stabilizing. Indonesia wants the United States in the region. And this is, again, that long-standing Indonesia preference for balance. Yes, China is a major investor, the most important investor, a critical relationship for Indonesia that they can't get wrong. Indonesia doesn't want any less Chinese engagement or investment, but it wants more American, more Japanese, more Korean, more European. So I think that all signals are positive in this regard, and we saw that in the extremely substantive, wide-ranging statement issued by both leaders after Prabowo's visit to the White House a week before last.
So when you get more of the United States, a lot of countries actually like to see that. One that is not quite as, maybe more ambivalent about that is, of course, China, which especially when it comes to U.S. military presence, U.S. intelligence collection, security presence, China would like to see a lot less U.S. presence, and the presence that it does see is actively pushing back against. So how does Indonesia look at U.S. military presence in Southeast Asia and the South China Sea?
Little remarked upon, but absolutely fascinating. When Prabowo was, in his previous 5 years, he was Minister of Defense. During his tenure as Indonesia's Minister of Defense, Indonesia hosted the largest ever Garuda Shield exercises, which is essentially Indonesia's exercising with the Allies, for lack of a better shorthand. And there were larger numbers of American and Australian troops on Indonesian territory or exercising Indonesian waters at any time since World War II. No one misses the significance of this. What are they exercising about? Who are they exercising potentially against? And China accepts that, or at least doesn't say much about it, because their interests are well served by the warm commercial and political relationship with Indonesia. Indonesia maintains a preference for Western arms. When Prabowo was Minister of Defense, he canceled the purchase of Russian arms in favor of European and American. Our expectations we're likely to see more of that. Prabowo is very proud of his longstanding relationships with the United States and the U.S. Armed Forces, and I don't think that's going to change. So our assumption is a default preference there. That certainly won't thrill the Chinese. Hence, I think we saw some language in that agreement with in Beijing that Indonesia and China should perhaps consider some greater defense cooperation in some way, shape, or form. The other thing, Ray, we haven't talked about is what else does China get politically from Indonesia? Indonesia, as I said before, proud of its role as a leader, the largest Muslim majority country in the world, Muslim world. Indonesia will never issue a word of criticism of or concern about the Muslim minority in China. Although Indonesia has been a vocal supporter and principled one over concerns of the treatment of Muslims in Myanmar, Rohingya, and other parts of the world. So I think this reflects an understanding, if you will. So even as Jokowi was, I would say frantically almost, furiously trying to improve the commercial investment relation with China, and as China was dramatically ramping up its investment in Indonesia's nickel industry, the Indonesian president once or twice held cabinet meetings on Indonesian warships way out in the South China Sea. Does that make a pretty powerful statement? So I think give full marks to Indonesia's diplomacy, which for a country which is not able to wield certain types of power because it doesn't have it, it pretty deftly manages this balance between China and the West. So it's just enormous incentive to maintain the good, strong commercial relationship with China and have a politically calm and mutually respectful relationship. China gets a lot out of that, as we've just said. So it's not just the commercial side. They get something also in terms of how Indonesia deals with it on other issues, including related to religion.
Given both the U.S. and China really are anxious for good relations with Indonesia, could Prabowo play a role in easing tensions between the two countries?
You know, when Yudhoyono was president, I think he saw himself in that role. And you'll remember, Jim, he tried to insert himself. I think the intention was genuine, and he genuinely wanted to be helpful, but was ineffectual at that time. I think Yudhoyono was interested in becoming a mediator on Korea, in the Middle East, and some other areas. And that didn't really go anywhere. I don't yet see, but it's very early days, right? I don't yet see that Prabowo has that intention or role. He got a lot of attention a year ago at Shangri-La Defense Dialogue, where he proposed and spoke openly about some of his ideas for a resolution in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia. But anytime we start talking about this, we have to return to what is his number one focus. Delivering quick wins on his election promises. So Indonesia is intelligible to Americans precisely because it does have a functioning, vibrant electoral democracy. The elections were free and fair, and he ran for election, which he won with 58% of the vote, on promising massive new investments in social welfare that voters want. So he's got to this has to be the focus, right? The other focus, we've been talking a lot about foreign policy, but that's massive, right? So starting January, Indonesia moves from $0 to $4.5 billion in the free food program, the free meals program for infants, toddlers, and young mothers. You know, so this is massive, right? And also, there's been a massive restructuring of the Indonesian government, the largest expansion and greatest increased complexity of the Indonesian government since 1966. So they've got a lot of fish to fry here, right, Jim? I mean, they've got the domestic government reorganization, which is massive. They've got huge new domestic programs that they wish to roll out in a way, I think, which will be, I would say, keen to have as responsible and effective. And clearly, in President Prabowo's first weeks in office, keen to have a more active international role at the same time. All this happening when we'll have a new government in the United States, and there'll be concerns about navigating between the U.S. and China at that time.
Well, speaking of fish to fry and movement, we'll get you out of this on this question, which is he's also having to now manage the movement of the capital. How is that going? And have you seen the new capital? What is it like? And when do you expect all of this to happen?
So Prabowo had a 50-minute inauguration speech. He didn't mention the new capital city one time. Not one time. And I think the assumption has been among Indonesian observers for a long time, the assumption has been that the new capital city, it has its merits, but this is very much a project associated with the ex-president. And that Prabowo will legitimately have his own priorities. And he ran for the presidency not on building the new capital, but on these social welfare programs. And so the numbers also are just not there in an environment where Indonesia now, because of rising concerns about interest rates, the desire to have a prudent fiscal policy, not to borrow wildly, to reassure markets, they're not going to be borrowing. So where do they get the money to fund the free school program, the nutrition program, expanded educational access? And they just announced free health screenings for every Indonesian citizen. This is real money. Slow down expenditure on the new capital city. I've been there, Ray. I went a year ago. It got a lot done in the past year. I went exactly a year ago this week, I think. You don't feel the excitement in this government about that project.
But was it Bauer Group Asia customers are not lining up to invest in the new capital?
Well, not only that, I think as explicitly acknowledged by former President Jokowi, foreign companies have not invested in the new capital city with a strong, and again, the rationale, we share this when I was president of AMCHAM, we would share this to government that, that our companies have a legitimate concern why they should invest in the new capital city if the Indonesian government itself has not allocated sufficient resources to build the new capital city. And you get an acknowledgement of that, basically, fair enough. So there's been very little in foreign investment in the new capital city because this is the one thing that foreign investors held off on. So the past year, Ray, do you mind if I just add one thing that was unique about Indonesia this year? 25 years of free and fair elections in this country since the overthrow of Suharto, from 1999 on. And in advance of every election in Indonesia, both domestic Indonesian investors and foreign investors would always pause their investment decisions. Commercial decisions and major investments were always put on hold because they wanted to see what the new government will do. That's been the pattern for 25 years, until this election. So it's extraordinary. It's almost as if it takes 25 years for a new conventional wisdom to take hold. And that is, well, actually, after every election over the last 25 years, Indonesia maintained budget sensibility. They have a good central bank. They didn't spend money they didn't have. They had a low deficit. And everyone is saying the same thing. We have nothing to worry about. And that's what happened. So this year, for the first time, neither Indonesian conglomerates, many of whom are still led by Indonesians of Chinese descent, historically the most sensitive to potential political instability, and foreign investors, there was no let-out in investment decisions or commercial decisions during this past year on that full expectation of stability, and that's what they got. The issue, though, is 5% growth is not enough. So as soon as they got that, they're pleased with the new government. The strong question in the international business community now is, we too were pleased to have contributed to this strong growth of 5% a year for 20, 25 years, but now you're really slipping back in the pack. Other countries have not stood still. Other countries in the region, Malaysia, Philippines, Vietnam, all have put into place new reforms and are driving much higher growth rates than Indonesia. So now our sense is 5% actually is seen more as stagnation. So how do we get further? Hence the need for more competitive, another round perhaps of foreign direct investment. But the one issue though, Ray, is on what foreign investors held off on. They all held off on anything to do with the new capital city, waiting to see. So that was the one issue that foreign investors didn't move on, right? Now the concerns have moved more quickly to, yes, we like the cabinet, heading in the right direction. There's no big surprises here. We're concerned about trade protectionism coming smack up against, what Indonesia wants to promote and generally is a more open investment climate. But what are you going to do next? You're not going to be able to dine off of the reforms of the last decade going into the future.
All right. Well, if our listeners want to know what Doug Ramage is going to do next, where should they keep up with you and your work and Bauer Group Asia in Indonesia?
Sorry, Ray. Can you repeat that as a question?
Oh, yeah, sure. If people want to keep up with you, I am a master at segues. I can't believe you didn't appreciate my segue more.
I did. I wasn't prepared for it.
And they want to keep up with Doug Ramage and his work and Bauer Group Asia in Indonesia. Where should they go? What website? What social media account? Where should people want to keep up with?
Go to our website, www.bowergroupasia.com, and you'll find all our contact details there.
All right. Well, thank you, sir, for joining us, and we hope to have you back in the future. Well, Jim, that was interesting. That's actually the second podcast we've done on the new Prabowo presidency. Of course, the first one was episode 26 with Gita Wirjawan. But that one I think, took on quite a different flavor, especially with the emphasis on that Doug has and the focus he has on foreign direct investment and the business climate.
Indonesia is the fourth most populous country in the world. Growing at 5%, it's still a very large economy. And it is the most frustrating place to do business with the loveliest people you'll ever meet. It used to drive me when I was the economic counselor at the embassy there, and it would just make me crazy because the potential is so huge and the problems are so vast. So hearing Doug say a lot of the issues have at least been ameliorated was really reassuring.
Yeah. Well, when he mentioned that, the sort of the comparison, the business environment with India, but my heart sank a little bit since just this week I've been struggling trying to get a business visa to India, and the most recent turn was that it was rejected without reason. So just sort of rejected. Feel free to try again if you like.
It's almost like they know you, Ray.
Exactly. So I was also, intrigued by his comment on, the whole joint development thing. Maybe it was a new team. And I think that's the story I think I keep running up against. And I ran into a very well person who didn't give me permission to use this, so I'll keep them anonymous. But very experienced Indonesia hand. And I asked straight out, I said, what do you think happened there? And he said, what do you think happened? I said, I kind of think maybe Prabowo got played. He goes, I kind of think so too. Basically here he was making this transition to the role. He's trying to make a good impression with everybody. And, Beijing just loves those circumstances because, that's the opportunity to kind of get you on something. But I wonder how that works for China in the long term. I mean, they get out of it. They get to sort of say something. So now he's on record saying he wants to do joint development, and now he's got to backpedal, and now he's going to remember that. So I just wonder how that works for them in the long term.
Yeah, in Southeast Asia, as you know, Ray, there's not a lot of love for China because China's the big person neighbor. It's like the U.S. with Latin America. We're too big to be powerful and big feet to be loved. China's the same way. So I think China says, yeah, we took advantage of the new guy. So what? What's it to you?
Right. Well, it's funny because I was actually watching during that entire period. So right before the inauguration, there was a survey happening in the North Tuna Sea with a contracted vessel from Norway doing basically racetracks, surveying the for hydrocarbons there in the North Tuna Sea for Indonesia. And it was being escorted by some Indonesian ships. And a China Coast Guard ship came over and basically began harassing it. And so Indonesia put out these videos of their Coast Guard going out to challenge this other ship, and it would go away and come back and over and over again. And then magically, about a week before Prabowo went to Beijing, it left. And then they had this thing in Beijing, and they say, "Hey, joint development." You can't help but think, was this all a power play? It's like, okay, we can make your life hard, or we can do some joint development. Why don't you just sign this here? And of course they don't have to say that, but that's just sort of the overtones that are over the whole thing. And we know that Beijing loves to test new governments.
And yeah, short term, they may get a win, but it'll be curious to see if this joint development actually goes forward.
Yeah, Doug seemed to think that was pretty unlikely.
Yeah.
As did the person I ran into today. All right. Well, so you've got lots of, as you mentioned, lots of time in Indonesia, especially your time in the embassy there. You have a story for us today?
Well, this is a story about thinking things through carefully before you undertake a trip. So I went up to see a fishing village off the coast of Papua. And, you always bring a little embassy swag to give out to people who host you.
Yeah.
So we go to this little fishing village, and they have houses built on stilts over the mangrove.
Yeah.
And so they don't have motorcycles or anything. They use boats, which have outboard motors, and they don't have doors with locks. They just have sort of beaded curtains. What is the swag I brought? Keychains. No one has a key.
Nobody has a key.
No one has a key, but I have keychains. Well, should you ever get a key, here's a place to put it.
I'm sure they were received very happily.
They didn't know what they were, but it had a nice U.S. Embassy logo. So
there we go.
More thought, Ray.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you think you've got that cultural sensitivity down, and then reality slaps you in the face.
I'm just a schmuck from the Bronx. What can I say?
All right. Well, speaking of schmucks, one guy who's not a schmuck is our producer, Ian Ellis Jones. See, Ian, you thought I was going to go somewhere else with that. Our great producer, who has these fantastic military and geopolitical graphics that he sends out on X. So you definitely should go follow him at Ian Ellis Jones there. Of course, if you like this podcast, there is more where this came from on our YouTube channel, where we now have, Jim, I just checked, 1,781 subscribers. So that's pretty good subscriber base for a 6-month-old podcast. You can find us at youtube.com at IP Podcast. You can also find us on X. This podcast has its own channel on X, which is at Indo-Pacific Podcast. Of course, if you like listening to podcasts like I do, the audio version is on all the services: Apple, Spotify, Amazon, all of them. So go look for our name. You can find us there, and you can find us on LinkedIn. We have our own page on LinkedIn if you want to follow us there. So if you do all that, make sure when you are there that you give us a like, that you give us a subscribe, help us get the word out. Become the 1,782nd subscriber on YouTube, and nobody knows how many subscribers anybody has on audio podcasts because there's a bazillion different services. Anyway, after you do that, make sure you come back next time and join us for our next edition of Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific?